Welcome back to the shop and to the channel. Making some progress here on the 13-inch South Bend lathe, and I want to move on and start disassembling here of the tailstock as well as the compound and the cross slide and what remains still on the saddle. Everything else that I've disassembled so far has been cleaned and stripped of paint. I have it all sorted into tubs and baggies and such, and sitting on a shelf in the corner of the shop waiting for me to find some time to paint them before I get it put back together. I also disassembled the motor off camera, and it looks like it's in pretty good shape. Now, I do think I need to replace these bearings. I'm having a little bit of trouble locating them. I can find like one here or one there that's a different number, but I'd like to find two that are matching. So I'm still hunting, and I feel pretty confident that I'll be able to find them. The bed is still sitting on the floor in the shop. I've got a little bit more paint to remove on the web, but then it should be ready to go to the grinders. I don't have the budget yet to take it to the grinders, but I'm getting closer. I've gotten some real nice donations from some viewers, and I ended up selling my Hobart welder that I repaired in a previous video. If you'd like to help me get a little bit closer to being able to take this to the grinder, the easiest thing that you can do is just watch this video all the way to the end. Give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, or there's some links in the description on how you can help out in other ways. And I thank you if you even consider that. Well, let's get back to taking some of this stuff apart. And I think I'm going to start here with the tailstock. This should be fairly straightforward. There's a couple of really long grub screws, even though they're kind of big to call them a grub screw, but they look like grub screws, so I'm going to call them grub screws. These adjust the center line of the tailstock when it's on the bed and allows you to either intentionally cut a taper or get the taper out of it when holding a piece of material between the chuck and like a live center. Well, with those big grub screws out, I can get this base off. It's a tight fit, as it should be. There's a groove that's milled into the bottom of the tailstock and a corresponding feature in the base that is pretty tight, close tolerance, so it's a little bit of an effort to get it out. And there's a couple of screws or bolts that were through the base here. This was for something the previous owner did. I think it was to keep the tailstock from crashing into a DRO that may have been mounted on the cross slide. A little different than the tailstock that's on my 42, this one actually has way wipers on the front and the back, and they're held in with a couple of screws. I don't know if these Phillips head screws are original, but I really don't like them being on this machine. So when I put it back together, I'm going to replace these with something that I feel like is a little more era appropriate. Well, with that piece out of the way, we'll go back to working on the main body of the tailstock here with the binding lever, which is part of the Quill lock. One thing you'll notice when I'm taking stuff like this apart, I don't necessarily do it in any particular order. And oftentimes I will see something that's like, oh, I can take that apart, so I'll do that. And in this case, there's a grub screw that locks in the key for the Quill, and it's here, so I'm going to go ahead and take that out. This will become a little bit more obvious of what this is for when we get to removing the key. Switching things up 180 degrees here. Let's go to the back of the tailstock and get this handle off. I do use an impact here to take this nut off, just because it's going to be a lot more efficient to use it than just a wrench. With the nut off, it's on there, the handle's on there pretty tight, and it is keyed. So I'm using a brass hammer, and I'm really taking light hits at this. I don't want to hit this thing very hard. These handles are cast iron, and they will break. Well, I'm really surprised at how loose this nut is, or back cap, whatever you want to call it. On the other tailstock I took apart, it was on there really, really tight. It actually took quite a bit of effort to get it off. Well, with that back nut off, the screw that goes up inside the quill of the tailstock, it's a left-hand thread, and it will just unthread from the back of the quill. Well, the threads on this thing look really good. Now, the end of it there is a bit mushroom. That's the end that is used to push out whatever you have mounted in the Morse taper. And to make it a little bit easier to get the quill out, I'm going to thread that back in just a little bit so I can push on it and get the quill out the front. With the quill out of the way, I can remove these plugs, which are the part of the quill lock. And there's two of them. There's one in the top and there's one in the bottom. And when you tighten that lever, it essentially pulls them together and clamps on the quill. And these are stuck in here really good, or at least the top one is. And it almost seems like it's a bit corroded, which is weird because it's aluminum. So there's some oxidation on it, which I really wasn't expecting. And I really wasn't expecting them to be made from aluminum. The ones on the 42 are steel. So I don't know if South Bend may have changed the material that they make these from, or if maybe these were a shop-made replacement at some time in the past. If you have a newisher, I guess, 1960 vintage South Bend, what are your plugs made out of? Are they aluminum or are they steel? Leave a comment. Let me know if you think these are original or if they were made after the fact. So I want to get this thing flipped over so I can remove the key. The key is pressed up in here from the bottom. It starts as a piece of round bar, but then there's a key that's machined in the top of it, a rectangular key. And that is what the quill rides on to keep it from rotating when it's in use. With this thing out here now, you can see how this is made. That key is machined into the top of this piece of round bar at the right angle, and it just sits up in a hole that's bored in the underside of the tailstock. It slides in this groove that is milled in the tailstock, which is currently full of gunk. Well, I'm going to remove the oil cups that are on the tailstock. Mostly because these have been painted over, and I'm going to replace them with new ones. I'm not going to be all that careful trying to get this out. If I crush it, it's no big deal. These are available from a few different sources, including McMaster Carr. Well, there's a piece of dried up old oil wick stuck down inside this hole. That'll get replaced. And once I get that out of this nut, that'll be it for the disassembly of the tailstock, and we can move back over to the compound cross slide and saddle. Well, I want to start taking apart this compound. This is, or should be, a fairly easy process to remove. Full disclosure, I had this thing apart before. So I know I'm going to run into some problems, and I'll explain those as I go. But when I first got the lathe, the compound was fairly bound up, and I wanted to use it. So I decided to take apart the compound and deal with that. So I found some issues with it that I know I'm going to have to address. Now, I didn't take it 100% apart, and you'll see why here when we get there. But for now, we'll just keep taking this thing down to its basic components. I can remove the gib retaining screw and slide the gib out. The gib itself looks to be in pretty decent shape. I don't know that I'm going to have to do much with it, but time will tell once we get down to the reassembly part of this. There's a socket head cap screw here underneath the swivel base that attaches the nut to it. Now, normally I would not take this off just yet. I would leave it on, and I would just unscrew the lead screw for the compound out of the casting. But as you'll see, there's a reason why I can't do that, and I have to take a slightly different approach. Well, I have this spanner wrench that's almost the right size. It could be a little bit bigger. That will let me unscrew this bushing from the top of the compound rest. With that screw loose and the gib out of the compound, it gives me a chance to sort of wiggle the nut out from underneath the swivel base in order to slide the base off of the dovetails. Well, and the reason why I've had to do it this way is that screw will not thread off of that nut. There is something that's jacked up about the threads at the end of the screw. It almost looks like something has welded itself to one revolution of the threads. I can't seem to figure out how they got this nut on, if it existed before. But at this point, I'm going to have to take this thing apart as it sits because I can't get that nut off, which is likely going to mean that I'm going to have to make a new lead screw, which is fine. I can do that, but wasn't something I really wanted to do, and that might also mean a new nut. I could have done this in a different order, but like I mentioned before, I rarely do things in a way that makes sense until after I've taken it all apart and thought to myself, well, that doesn't make sense. I should have done it a different way. So I'm going to back up a little bit and screw that bushing back into the compound so I can get the handle and the dial off of the end of the screw. Now there's a nut that's on the end of the shaft here that has a couple of grooves in it that takes sort of a special screwdriver, I guess like a split tongue screwdriver. I don't know what you want to call it. But the grooves are, they're so messed up from, I'm assuming from somebody else taking them apart, that this is going to be a challenge. And I need to get this handle and the dial off in order to get the screw out of the top of the compound rest, because it ain't coming out any other way unless I cut it apart as it sits. And I really don't want to do that yet, because I'm going to need to take some measurements eventually to make a new one. So I'm just going to use a series of punches and a hammer to get into the slot on this rounded over nut until I can get it off. I'm likely going to have to make a new one of those as well. All right, we got that nut off now, and you can see how kind of messed up these grooves are. I mean, I didn't make them any better, but I don't think it'll be too hard to make a new one of those. And now I can get the handle off. There is a dowel pin that keys it to the shaft. I want to make sure I don't lose that. The dial will slide off of the screw pretty easily, and then I can unscrew that bushing again from the compound. And that'll let me get this lead screw and nut out of the compound. Well, the threads on this actually look like they're in pretty good shape except for that one spot. So it's a shame that I'm going to have to cut this thing apart. At least I think I'm going to have to cut it apart unless I can figure out how to deal with those threads. Then I'll have to make a new one. But that's it for the compound. Well, the cross slide should be a little bit easier in comparison. We'll start by removing the gib retaining screw and the gib. Well, I just realized I'm not going to be able to get the gib out until I get the dial out because it's going to be in the way. So let me turn my attention to something else. Well, I got a big adjustable wrench here on the crossfeed bushing. We'll go ahead and get that unscrewed out of the saddle. Well, with this crossfeed bushing unscrewed from the saddle, I can unthread the crossfeed lead screw from the cross slide. Well, once I scrape all of the junk out of the slots of the crossfeed nut screw, I can remove that, which will free up the crossfeed nut. I'm going to need to get that off before I can slide the cross slide off of the saddle. I'm going to go ahead and remove this chip guard here just to get it out of the way. Well, last thing to do here for the compound is to slide this gib out. It also looks like it's in pretty decent shape, and I should be able to get this now all the way off of the saddle. Everything underneath here looks like it's in pretty good shape too. We'll know more when we get it cleaned up. Well, since they're in front of me and I'm looking at them, I might as well go ahead and remove these way wiper covers and the old felt that's back behind them. These Phillips head screws that are on here, again, don't seem to feel right to me. I think when this goes back together, maybe I'll try to find some round head slotted brass screws that'll go along with the brass way wiper covers. Well, the last thing here to remove on the saddle is what's called a chip collar. It's basically a little bushing that goes around the lead screw, and I think its intention is to, based on its name, to keep chips from coming down inside that cavity, which could ultimately end up with chips inside of the apron, and that would be pretty bad for the gears that are in there. Well, with all those bigger parts apart, now I can come back here to the crossfeed screw and try to get this disassembled. I have it mounted in my bench vise, and again I'm using a punch and a hammer to try to get that slotted screw out. The slots in this one are even worse than the ones that were in the compound. Well, I feel like I'm going to need to put a little more force on this, and to keep from bending the lead screw, we'll get some 2x4, some scrap wood here, and use it as cribbing up underneath this dial, and that should give me some stability in the screw that I should be able to now, I guess, hammer on that slotted nut a little bit harder without fear that I'll end up bending the screw, at least not too badly. Well, I am struggling with trying to get this nut off of the end of the shaft here. There just isn't much slot left in this nut. I wish this camera angle was a little bit better that you could see it, but you know, hitting it with a punch is just gliding off. I'm going to have to try something a little bit different. Well, I'm going to end up replacing this nut anyway, so I might as well go ahead and make my own slots, and might as well make them round. So I'll drill into where those slots are. Hopefully I won't be doing too much damage to the lead screw, the threads on the back of it. I think we can deal with that if that's the case, but at least putting a little bit of a deeper slot in it with a screw, I should be able to have maybe a little bit better luck in getting this thing off. That was a little bit of work. I'll definitely need to be making a new one of those, and so might as well make two, one for this one and one for the compound. That handle's on there pretty tight, but a few taps from a brass hammer I should be able to get it off. Well, I've already removed the clamping screw for this dial, so I'm not sure why it's on here so tight, but it is a really tight fit, nice and close tolerance. I guess I like that. I'd rather have it too tight or a little bit too tight than way too loose, but I think just working this back and forth a little bit and it'll eventually come off the end of the shaft. There is nothing else that is holding this on here. Well, there is a pin that holds this little sleeve onto the crossfeed screw, so I'll get my cribbing back up underneath here and we'll go ahead and take a punch and knock that out. Well, I don't remember if the 1942 had such a short pin on that sleeve. I'll have to go back and look at that video and see how long it is. I would have expected to go all the way through. Well, I should be able to pull that sleeve off with the crossfeed bushing. Now there is a thrust bearing there behind that sleeve. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find a replacement for that, but I'll make sure I keep these together in the orientation they are now. I'll certainly get these cleaned up in the ultrasonic just in case I can't find a more modern replacement. And there's another set of thrust bearings on the other end of that bushing. Well, the threads on the lead screw actually look pretty good. There is definitely some wear on them in the center here. Enough that I figure I've got it apart. I might as well go ahead and fix this. Probably just get a section of Acme rod from McMaster and just graft it onto the end of this existing shaft. Well, aside from that nut and thread on the compound, we got everything apart. We got everything apart to its smallest piece, I think, just about anyway. So now it's just going to be hours of time in the ultrasonic and stripping paint and getting ready to repaint all of this for reassembly. I actually look forward to the cleaning process. I enjoy it. I don't think I'm going to like the painting process so much, but we'll get to it. And I think I've got some good plans for the paint. Well, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Drop a comment down below. Let me know what you think. Am I entertaining you with these, or do you find it informative, or is this just a big fat waste of time? In any case, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you know when the next video gets published. Well, I appreciate you watching. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next one.